There is an interdisciplinary research question that has been asked by many scientists for several decades. Why are there sex differences in spatial navigation? This question has been investigated by scientists from multiple angles, and that includes endocrinology, evolutionary anthropology, cognitive psychology, and human geography. Spatial navigation is, at its core, a multifaceted topic that has been analyzed from these disciplines drawn from a range of theories, yielding results that are both unique and complementary in some way. In this video, we'll be exploring the perspective of an endocrinologist to determine how they would try to answer why sex differences exist in spatial navigation. But before we dive in, what is endocrinology to begin with, and what are the types of questions endocrinologists usually ask? To start off, endocrinology is the study of hormones. In order to get an idea of what hormones specifically are, let's take a deeper look into the blood vessels where you can see them in more detail. Just like your red blood cells, hormones are found in the bloodstream. They're chemical compounds produced from glands that are secreted and travel through the bloodstream, acting as messengers to influence the nervous system and regulate physiology and behavior of an organism. Endocrinologists are concerned with two main classes of hormones, the first of them being peptide hormones. Peptide hormones are the largest class of hormones, and some examples include insulin as well as leptin. On the other hand, steroid hormones are all derived from cholesterol, and they're pretty small compared to peptide hormones. Some examples include testosterone, estradiol, and progesterone. But what types of glands are these hormones secreted from, and where do these hormones go to? That's exactly what an endocrinologist would ask. So let's travel with these hormones to find out. As mentioned earlier, endocrinology is the study of hormones. To be more specific, it's the study of the endocrine system, which is made up of a network of glands in your body that make the hormones to allow cells to talk to one another. Endocrinologists want to understand what the major endocrine glands are and what effects hormones have on the body. It all starts with the brain, which can be compared to as the main on and off switch for all endocrine glands. The hypothalamus controls another part of your brain called the pituitary gland, which secretes a cascade of hormones to other glands in the body. Hormones secreted from the thyroid helps with growth and development, as well as regulating your metabolism. And if you've ever heard of the fight or flight response before, you'll remember that the adrenal gland regulates emotional arousal, among other things like salt and carbohydrate metabolism and inflammatory reactions. The pancreas is another major endocrine gland that regulates blood sugar and sugar metabolism. And finally, we have the gonads. For males, it's the testes, and for females, it's the ovaries. These endocrine glands regulate reproduction and body development. Hormones are also received by other parts of the body, such as the bones, muscles, skin, and so forth. This list is quite inclusive and speaks to the powerful role that hormones have in maintaining our daily livelihood. But in order to reach this extensive network in the body, hormones communicate in a fascinating self-regulatory system called the negative feedback loop. In this video, we're going to follow the hypothalamic, pituitary, and gonadal axis, also known as the HPG axis. So like the analogy we used before, the brain is the main primary on and off switch, waiting for the right message to turn on. When the appropriate moment arrives, the hypothalamus, sitting at the center of the brain, receives the signal to flip the switch from off to on, releasing a specific hormone that tells the pituitary gland, which was originally turned off, to now turn on. While the endocrine glands are the on and off switches, hormones can be thought of as keys because they turn on specific endocrine glands by latching onto receptors, which act as keyholes. Once turned on, the pituitary churns out two specific hormones, one called luteinizing hormone, LH, and the other called follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH. These two hormones travel through the body to reach the gonads. LH and FSH signal to the testes and ovaries to turn on, so that these gonads can produce sex steroid hormones. The testes produces testosterone, while the ovaries produces estradiol and progesterone. These sex hormones are secreted into the bloodstream and travel throughout the body to regulate reproduction and behavior. When these released hormones peak at a certain level, this message reaches to the brain to give the signal to now stop producing these sex steroid hormones. These same hormones, which needed a cascade of other hormones to turn the gonads on, are now the same chemical compounds used to turn off the primary switch of the brain from on to off. hence the name of the negative feedback loop. One of the most profound hormonal processes that occur in females as a result of the HPG axis and natural changes of hormones is the menstrual cycle.
This might seem hard to believe, but right now, 300 million women across the planet are experiencing the same thing, a period. The monthly menstrual cycle that leads to the period is a reality most women on Earth will go through in their lives. But why is this cycle so universal? And what makes it a cycle in the first place? Periods last anywhere between 2 and 7 days, arising once within a 28-day rotation. That whole system occurs on repeat, happening approximately 450 times during a woman's life. Behind the scenes are a series of hormonal controls that fine-tune the body's internal workings to make menstruation start or stop during those 28 days. This inner machinery includes 2 ovaries stocked with thousands of tiny sacs called follicles that each contain 1 oocyte, an unfertilized egg cell. At puberty, ovaries hold over 400,000 egg cells, but release only 1 each month, which results in pregnancy or a period. Here's how the cycle unfolds. Each month, beginning around puberty, the hormone-producing pituitary gland in the brain starts releasing 2 substances into the blood: follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. When they reach the ovaries, they encourage the internal egg cells to grow and mature. The follicles respond by pumping out estrogen. The egg cells grow and estrogen levels peak, inhibiting the production of FSH and telling the pituitary to pump out more LH. That causes only the most mature egg cell from one of the ovaries to burst out of the follicle and through the ovary wall. This is called ovulation, and it usually happens 10 to 16 days before the start of a period. The tiny oocyte moves along the fallopian tube. A pregnancy can only occur if the egg is fertilized by a sperm cell within the next 24 hours. Otherwise, the egg's escapade ends and the window for pregnancy closes for that month. Meanwhile, the now empty follicle begins to release progesterone, another hormone that tells the womb's lining to plump up with blood and nutrients in preparation for a fertilized egg that may embed there and grow. If it doesn't embed, a few days later the body's progesterone and estrogen levels plummet, meaning the womb stops padding out and starts to degenerate, eventually falling away. Blood and tissue leave the body, forming the period. The womb can take up to a week to clear out its unused contents, after which the cycle begins anew. Soon afterwards, the ovaries begin to secrete estrogen again, and the womb lining thickens, getting ready to accommodate a fertilized egg or be shed. Hormones continually control these activities by circulating in ideal amounts, delivered at just the right time.
Within the realm of how hormones affect physiology and behavior, endocrinologists could ask almost anything, so this video will narrow it down to the brain and sex steroid hormones. We're going to examine the questions neuroendocrinologists would ask, such as which brain areas are influenced by hormones and how hormones influence higher-order cognition. The brain is richly decorated with estrogen receptors, namely estrogen receptor alpha and beta, in certain brain areas that are important for learning and memory, and to our surprise, spatial navigation. Estrogen targets many different sites of the brain, including the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and cerebellum. The prefrontal cortex is located just behind your forehead and is involved in complex cognitive behavior, such as planning and temporarily holding information in your mind and later working with it. The hippocampus, which is Greek for seahorse, is important for encoding different types of memories, such as the date of your birthday and the location of where you parked your car. The cerebellum is also called the little brain, and surprisingly is mostly dense with estrogen receptor beta. It's been known to be involved in fine-tuning body movements and motor skills, but recent research has shown that the cerebellum is also involved in aspects of spatial cognition. This is a neuron in the female rodent brain. Neurons are brain cells, and they have long branches called dendrites, which are covered with little stubs and spines to talk to other neurons. This neuron comes from the hippocampus, that seahorse-shaped structure in the brain that's important for learning and memory. While female humans have the menstrual cycle, Female rodents have what's called an estrous cycle, which lasts about 4 to 5 days. Estradiol levels rise and fall at different phases of the estrous cycle. During diestrus, which is the beginning of the cycle, estradiol levels are low. The next phase is proestrus, which is the day of ovulation when estradiol levels surge and are at their highest. Research has found that estradiol promotes the growth of bulb-like spines on the branches of neurons, which helps increase connections between other cells. You can see a big difference just by comparing the before and after photos. And finally, we circle back to the estrus phase, when estradiol levels are decreasing as a result after ovulation. Without high levels of circulating estradiol, the dendrites no longer have as many spines. This begs the question of whether these hormonal changes affect learning and memory or other behaviors and cognitive functions at different phases or points of the cycle. So far, we've touched on the ways endocrinologists examine the effects of endogenous or naturally occurring hormones that circulate in the body and how they can affect brain structure and function. But endocrinologists can also experimentally manipulate these natural hormones to produce similar or different effects on physiology and behavior. One of these methods involves surgical removal of the gonads to permanently prevent the secretion of sex steroid hormones. Endocrinologists can also use chemical injections into the bloodstream to temporarily disrupt certain hormones from binding to their receptors. They can also add back hormones into the body, which are then called exogenous hormones because they're synthetically made or they're hormones that don't naturally occur in your body. The other common chemical method for controlling hormones is by using medication, such as the birth control pill. In one research study, scientists trained female monkeys to remember a specific shape. After a period of delay, the monkeys are shown 2 different shapes. This task requires the monkey to remember which shape they remember from before and select the non-matching shape during the testing phase. This task requires the monkeys to use their prefrontal cortex to process information and work with it to make the correct choice. In this experiment, neuroendocrinologists trained female monkeys and then surgically removed their ovaries to deplete them of estrogen. The overrectomized monkeys were then separated into 2 groups. One group received a vehicle or placebo injection, and the other group received an estradiol injection. This graph shows that across different delays between training and testing, the monkeys receiving the estradiol treatment, represented by the black circles, performed significantly better at the task than the monkeys receiving the placebo, represented by the white circles. In addition to differences in behavioral performance, the researchers discovered that the neurons in the prefrontal cortex between the 2 groups have different numbers of bulb-like spines sitting on the dendrites. The spines in the estradiol treatment group were more dense, and this change in physiology influences the performance in working memory. This experiment serves as an example that endocrinologists are using many different tools and asking interesting questions to try to understand the impact of hormones on the brain, body, and behavior. One of the big questions that has been asked is, why are there sex differences in spatial navigation? An endocrinologist's perspective, of course, will have to argue that hormones play an important role in why there are sex differences. And this is because hormones have been shown to regulate different navigation strategies. A classic experiment from the early 1900s involving a tea maze has proven that there are 2 main forms of navigation. In that experiment, a rat was trained to always start at the north end of the tea maze and find its way to the goal location where there's a food reward. In this example, the rat always makes a right turn to arrive at its goal, and it eventually learns this because it makes less errors. But in order to test whether the rat has really learned the location of the goal, the tea maze was flipped 180 degrees, so that the rat is starting at the end of the tea maze from the south instead of from the north. The fruit reward is still placed on the west arm of the tea maze, but this means when the tea maze was flipped, making a right turn yields an incorrect decision. If the rat has really learned the location of the reward, it will know that it needs to turn left because the tea maze was flipped. By turning towards the same spatial location in the room where it was rewarded previously, the rat is using a place strategy. And different strategies rely on different processes by different parts of the brain. The place strategy is the hippocampus-dependent spatial strategy that involves creating relationships between the different landmarks in the environment to incorporate into a cognitive or mental map, and this depends on the ability to flexibly respond to environmental cues. On the other hand, If the rat turns right in the direction it was always trained to, it's using what's called a response strategy. This response strategy is based on the caudate-dependent response strategy, incorporating stimulus-response associations to orient yourself in space. This depends on the ability to quickly recognize and react to situations with well-learned action-outcome relationships. However, hormones can manipulate whether an individual tends to use one strategy over the other. Female rodents engaged in the spatial navigation task were tested at different phases of their estrus cycle to examine the influence of naturally fluctuating estradiol levels. During estrus, when estradiol level is low, the animals have a preference for a rigid response learning strategy. This can be explained by the few dendritic spines within the hippocampus. During proestrus, however, when estradiol levels are elevated, the female rodents shift their preference for a flexible place learning strategy. At this time, estradiol promotes the growth of spines on the neuronal branches, which makes communication between neurons and ultimately using hippocampal-dependent place strategy more likely. The menstrual and estrus cycle are examples to show that hormones can change monthly and daily, but did you know that hormones can also change throughout the year? The reproductive cycles of many species have been characterized by distinct seasonal confinedness and synchronization. Studies of mammals such as mice and shrews have demonstrated that hormones rise and fall with the seasonal changes, and that in turn is correlated with the changes of brain mass, especially the hippocampus, throughout the year. Total brain and hippocampal volume is greater during the summer when daylight hours are longer, such as the months of June to September. During the winter, from the months of December through March, when daylight hours are much shorter, mice show reductions in both total brain and hippocampal volume, as well as fewer dendritic spines in the hippocampus. Reproductive periods during the year are a factor in the seasonal changes in hormones, which can switch on competing hormonal changes throughout the brain. An experiment that tested 2 species of voles speaks to the relationship between hippocampal volume and gonadal hormones. The vole on the left is a pine vole, and this species is monogamous. On the right is a meadow vole, whose species is polygamous. Males during the breeding season search and travel to look for females to mate with. The pine vole mates for life and doesn't need to travel far as it stays close to his partner. However, the meadow vole has many different female partners. He travels far and wide so that he can mate with each female, and as you can imagine, that requires having to keep track of where each of them are as he makes his way to visit each one from time to time. The range size of the monogamous vole is small because he doesn't need to stay too far to find his partner, whereas the range size of the polygamous vole is large because he requires the space to navigate to his many different partners. Scientists found that the polygamous voles have larger hippocampi compared to the monogamous voles, and this can be interpreted as having much more need for spatial memory requirements. Additionally, it is the only polygamous male voles that show stronger sex differences in brain size and spatial ability. Reproductive periods activate sex steroid hormones to spike, but this could be a tug of war between mutual influence between sexual activity and hormonal changes. Since sex steroid hormone levels change regularly from season to season, it can be assumed on the basis of the negative feedback principle that hippocampal changes are closely connected with both hormonal level changes and spatial behavioral dynamics. From endocrinology, you've learned that hormones are small chemicals that have enormous influence on physiology and behavior. Levels of gonadal hormones should be taken into account when examining sex differences in spatial navigation performance. This leaves many open questions. Are there seasonal variations in human spatial navigation? Do sex differences exist in different environments? Can exogenous hormones, like taking oral contraceptives or being exposed to plastic chemicals, change spatial behavior and influence brain structure and function? Spatial navigation is interdisciplinary, and it's important to keep in mind that the explanation for why there are sex differences is coming from only one of many perspectives. In science, human beings perform experiments, and they bring with them their own unique experiences and ideas that lead to asking different questions and even arguing for different interpretations of the same answer. It is by embracing and learning from these differences that we can begin to understand our world as it continually changes around us. Thanks for watching and joining me. If you have any questions or would like to reach out, please be in touch. Thanks and take care.